The morning sun painted golden streaks across the London sky as 8-year-old Tommy held his mother's hand at the train station. His world was different from most children his age. Born without sight, Tommy experienced life through a symphony of sounds, the texture of everything he touched and the warmth of people around him. Today was special. Today his mother Lisa had promised him something extraordinary. "Are we really going to see the Queen's Castle, Mom?" Tommy asked, his voice bubbling with excitement. His small fingers traced the rough texture of the train seat as they settled in for the journey to Windsor. Lisa smiled, watching her son's animated face. She had been saving every spare penny for 8 months, working extra shifts at the local diner just to make this dream come true. Tommy had always been fascinated by stories of knights, castles, and royal guards. When other kids his age were playing video games, Tommy would sit by the radio, listening to documentaries about British history, soaking up every detail about the monarchy and their traditions. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to Windsor Castle. You'll get to hear the guards marching, and maybe we'll even see the famous ceremony everyone talks about," Lisa replied, her heart swelling with joy at seeing her son so happy. The train journey felt like an adventure itself. Tommy pressed his ear to the window, listening to the changing sounds as they passed through different areas. The busy hum of London gradually gave way to quieter countryside noises. He could hear birds singing and occasionally, the distant sound of church bells. "Tell me again about the guards, Mom," Tommy said, settling back in his seat. Lisa had told this story countless times, but she never tired of seeing Tommy's reaction. "Well, they wear bright red uniforms and tall black hats called bearskins. They stand perfectly still like statues protecting the castle. They're trained to be so disciplined that they don't move or speak while they're on duty. But they're real people underneath, right?" Tommy asked thoughtfully. "Of course they are, honey. They're just doing their very important job." Tommy nodded seriously. He had always been good at sensing things about people that others missed. His mother often said he had a special gift for knowing when someone was kind, even before they spoke a word. When they finally arrived at Windsor, the sheer scale of the place overwhelmed even Lisa. The ancient stone wall seemed to stretch endlessly upward, and the sound of hundreds of tourists filled the air. Tommy stopped walking and tilted his head, taking it all in. "It sounds huge, Mom, like really, really big." "It is, sweetheart. It's been here for almost 1,000 years." They joined a group of tourists gathering near the main courtyard. Tommy noticed how everyone's voices seemed smaller here, as if the castle itself commanded respect. He could hear footsteps echoing off stone walls, the flutter of flags in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of military drums. A tour guide's voice cut through the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, in just a few minutes you'll witness one of Britain's most treasured traditions. The changing of the guard ceremony has been performed here for centuries." Tommy's grip on his mother's hand tightened with anticipation. He had dreamed about this moment for so long. All those nights listening to stories, imagining what it would be like to actually be here. And now it was really happening. As they moved closer to the viewing area, Tommy became aware of the different accents around him. There were American tourists excitedly taking photos, a Japanese family speaking in hushed, respectful tones, and an elderly British couple explaining the ceremony to their grandchildren. "Can we get close to the front, Mom? I want to hear everything really clearly." Lisa gently guided Tommy through the crowd. People naturally seemed to make way when they saw the small boy with his white cane, and soon they found themselves right at the rope barrier that separated visitors from the ceremony area. Tommy ran his free hand along the rope, feeling its thickness and texture. Everything was new and exciting to explore. The ground beneath his feet changed from smooth pavement to old cobblestones, each one telling a story of all the people who had walked here before. "I can smell history here, Mom," Tommy said quietly. Lisa looked down at her son, amazed as always by his unique way of experiencing the world. "What does history smell like?" "Old stones and something like respect, and maybe a little bit of magic." The crowd began to grow larger around them. Tommy could sense the anticipation building. Cameras clicked constantly, and he could hear parents lifting small children onto their shoulders for a better view. Tour guides were giving last-minute explanations in multiple languages. "In my country, we have nothing like this," he heard a woman say with what sounded like an Italian accent. "It's remarkable how they keep these traditions alive," replied her companion. Tommy listened to every conversation, every comment. He was building a picture in his mind of not just the castle, but of all the people who had come from around the world to witness this moment. It made him feel connected to something much bigger than himself. A sudden hush fell over the crowd. In the distance, Tommy could hear the faint sound of marching feet, growing gradually louder. His heart began to race with excitement. "They're coming, aren't they, Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart." "The ceremony is about to begin." Tommy straightened up, every sense alert and ready. This was the moment he had been waiting for his entire 8 years of life. The sounds grew clearer now. The precise rhythm of boots on stone, the jingling of ceremonial equipment, and underneath it all, the quiet breathing of hundreds of people holding their breath in anticipation. He pressed closer to the rope barrier, his small hands gripping it tightly. Soon, he would experience something that millions of people had witnessed over the centuries. He would be part of this amazing tradition, even if he couldn't see it with his eyes. The marching grew louder, and Tommy smiled the biggest smile of his life. He was about to meet the Queen's guards, even if they would never know he was there. But somehow, deep in his heart, Tommy felt like this visit was going to be more special than even his wildest dreams had imagined. As the first sounds of the ceremony began to echo through the ancient courtyard, Tommy took a deep breath and prepared to experience magic. The first sound that reached Tommy's ears was like thunder rolling across the ancient stones. But this wasn't weather. This was the synchronized marching of the Queen's Guard, their boots hitting the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. The 8-year-old boy pressed himself against the rope barrier, his heart beating almost as loudly as the approaching drums. "Here they come," whispered his mother, Lisa, her voice filled with the same wonder that had captured Tommy completely. The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath collectively. Tommy could sense hundreds of people leaning forward, cameras ready, everyone waiting for that first glimpse of the famous red uniforms. But for Tommy, the anticipation was different. He didn't need to see them to feel the power and majesty of what was approaching. The marching grew louder, more distinct. Tommy's enhanced hearing, sharpened by years of relying on sound rather than sight, began to pick up details that others missed entirely. He could hear the slight difference in the footsteps of each guard. Some boots landed just a fraction heavier than others. Some had a slightly different rhythm. To everyone else, it was one perfect unified sound. To Tommy, it was like listening to a complex musical composition where each instrument played its own unique part. "How many are there, Mom?" Tommy whispered, not wanting to disturb the solemnity of the moment. "I count about 12 in the front group," Lisa replied softly, "and there are more coming behind them." Tommy nodded, his mind creating a picture from the sounds. He could hear the rustle of their uniforms, the gentle clinking of their ceremonial equipment, and something else. The controlled breathing of men who had trained for years to perform this ritual with absolute precision. As the guards entered the main courtyard, the crowd's excitement became almost tangible. Tommy heard camera shutters clicking like rainfall, excited whispers in dozens of languages, and the soft gasps of children seeing the ceremony for the first time. "They're so tall," breathed a little girl standing somewhere behind Tommy. "And their hats are enormous." Tommy smiled at her wonder. He might not be able to see the famous bearskin hats or the bright red tunics, but he was experiencing something just as magical. The sound of tradition that had echoed through these same stones for hundreds of years. The drums grew louder as the band approached. Tommy felt the vibrations through his feet, through the rope he was gripping, even through the air itself. It was as if the entire castle was humming with the rhythm of the ceremony. Then came a moment of sudden quiet. The marching stopped. Tommy held his breath along with everyone else, sensing that something important was about to happen. A commanding voice rang out across the courtyard, sharp, clear, and filled with authority. Though Tommy couldn't understand all the military commands, he could feel their power. These weren't just words. They were orders that had been given in this exact same way for generations. The guards began to move with a precision that amazed Tommy. He could hear them turning, stepping, presenting their weapons, all in perfect unison. Every movement created its own sound. The rustle of fabric, the click of metal, the shuffle of feet finding their exact positions. "It's like a dance," Tommy whispered to his mother. "It really is," she agreed, watching the intricate choreography unfold before them. But Tommy was beginning to notice something else. something that fascinated him even more than the ceremony itself. As the guards took their final positions around the courtyard, he started to pick up on their individual presence. His gift for sensing people's energy, something his mother had always marveled at, was telling him stories about each guard. There was one guard positioned almost directly in front of where Tommy stood. Something about this particular person felt different from the others. While all the guards maintained their professional stillness, this one seemed to have a gentleness about him that Tommy could somehow sense. Maybe it was the way he breathed, or some subtle quality in his posture, but Tommy felt drawn to him in a way he couldn't explain. The ceremony continued around them. The old guard was formally relieved and the new guard took their positions. Tourists began taking photos with renewed enthusiasm, and children started asking their parents endless questions about what they were seeing. Tommy listened to it all with fascination. He heard an elderly man explaining to his grandson how this tradition connected them to centuries of British history. A tourist from Australia was marveling at how different this was from anything back home. A teenage girl was excitedly texting her friends about seeing real royal guards, but Tommy's attention kept returning to that one guard standing almost directly in front of him. There was something about this person that made Tommy feel safe and curious at the same time. He had always been good at reading people's energy, at knowing who was kind and who wasn't, who was patient and who was rushed. This guard felt patient. He felt kind. As the formal ceremony concluded and tourists began to spread out around the courtyard, Tommy remained at the barrier. His mother assumed he was just taking in all the sounds and atmosphere, which was partly true. But there was something else drawing him to stay right where he was. The guard hadn't moved, of course. Royal guards were famous for their ability to stand perfectly still for hours, no matter what happened around them. Tommy had heard stories of guards remaining motionless even when tourists tried to make them laugh or when unexpected things happened nearby. But this guard felt different to Tommy. Beneath the formal stillness required by his duty, Tommy sensed a real person, someone with feelings and thoughts and maybe even a sense of humor. Someone who might understand what it was like to experience the world in a different way. The crowd around them began to thin as people moved on to other parts of their castle tour. Some stopped to take final photos with the guards. Others headed toward the gift shop or the castle's other attractions. But Tommy stayed right where he was, his small hand still gripping the rope barrier. His attention focused entirely on the guard who had somehow captured his interest. "Are you ready to see more of the castle, sweetheart?" Lisa asked gently. Tommy hesitated. He wasn't quite ready to leave yet. Something was telling him that this moment wasn't finished, that there was still something important about to happen. He had learned to trust these feelings over his 8 years of life. "Can we stay just a little bit longer, Mom? Please?" Lisa looked at her son's earnest face and nodded. She had long ago learned to trust Tommy's instincts about people and situations. If he wanted to stay, there was probably a good reason for it. So they remained at the barrier, Tommy continuing to focus on the guard who had somehow spoken to his heart without saying a single word. Neither of them knew it yet, but they were about to share a moment that would touch not just their own lives but the lives of millions of people around the world. As the crowd continued to thin around the courtyard, Tommy found himself in a bubble of quiet focus. The formal ceremony had ended, but the guards remained at their posts as still as the ancient statues that decorated the castle walls. Most tourists had moved on, eager to explore the castle's other attractions, but Tommy felt rooted to this spot. His mother Lisa stood beside him, patient as always, understanding that her son experienced the world on his own timeline. She had learned years ago not to rush Tommy when he was processing something important. His way of understanding people and places was different, deeper somehow, and it often led to remarkable insights. Tommy's attention remained fixed on the guard positioned almost directly in front of him. There was something about this person that kept pulling at Tommy's consciousness like a gentle magnet. In his 8 years of life, Tommy had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's energy. His blindness had heightened all his other senses, but beyond that, he seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human nature that amazed everyone who knew him. This guard felt different from the others. Not better or worse, just different. Where the other guards projected the expected aura of formal duty and professional distance, this one seemed to carry something extra, a warmth that Tommy could somehow detect despite the man's required stillness and silence. "Mom," Tommy whispered, "do you think the guards ever get lonely standing there by themselves?" Lisa considered the question. "I suppose they might, sweetheart. But they're trained to focus on their important job of protecting the castle." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "But they're still people underneath their uniforms, right? They still have feelings and families and favorite foods and things that make them happy?" "Of course they do," Lisa replied, touched by her son's empathy. "They're just doing their duty right now." This conversation sparked something in Tommy's mind. All his life, adults had told him about the importance of rules and proper behavior. He knew about staying in lines, not touching things that weren't his, and being respectful in important places. But he also knew something else that seemed more important, that connection between people was one of the most beautiful things in the world. Tommy had spent his life reaching out to understand his environment through touch. His fingers had explored thousands of textures, surfaces, and objects, each one teaching him something new about the world around him. Touch was his window into understanding things that others took for granted through sight. But this situation was different. This wasn't about exploring an object or understanding a physical space. This was about connecting with another human being who seemed somehow to need that connection as much as Tommy did. The guard hadn't moved a muscle since taking his position. His training was evident in every aspect of his posture, the perfectly straight line of his back, the precise angle of his head, the exact positioning of his feet. To every observer, he was the perfect example of royal discipline and dedication. But Tommy sensed something more. Maybe it was the subtle rhythm of the guard's breathing, or some barely perceptible shift in the energy around him. But Tommy felt like this person was aware of him in return. Not visibly, of course. The guard's training would never allow such an obvious break in protocol. But on some deeper level, Tommy sensed a mutual recognition. It was like when Tommy sometimes felt his mother watching him with love from across a room, even when she hadn't made a sound. Or like when his teacher at school would pause during a lesson, and Tommy would somehow know she was smiling at him before she even spoke. These moments of unspoken communication had always been precious to Tommy. Now he felt something similar happening with this guard. Despite the formal barrier between them, despite the rules and protocols and centuries of tradition, Tommy sensed a human connection waiting to be acknowledged. The thought grew stronger in Tommy's mind. What if he reached out? Not to cause trouble or break rules, but simply to say hello in the only way he knew how. What if this guard, standing alone in his formal duty, would appreciate knowing that someone saw him as a real person, and not just part of the castle's decoration? Tommy's hands tightened on the rope barrier as he wrestled with this decision. His mother had always taught him to be respectful of other people's boundaries and responsibilities. He knew that these guards had an important job to do, and he didn't want to interfere with that. But there was something else his mother had taught him, something that seemed even more important in this moment. She had always told him that kindness was the most powerful force in the world, and that sometimes the smallest gestures could make the biggest difference in someone's life. What if this guard was having a difficult day? What if he was missing his family or feeling tired from standing for so long? What if he was wondering if anyone saw him as more than just a tourist attraction? Tommy thought about all the times in his own life when a simple touch had meant everything to him. When he was scared, his mother's hand on his shoulder could calm him instantly. When he was excited about something, holding someone's hand helped him share that joy. When he was curious about something new, touch was his way of exploring and understanding. Maybe, Tommy thought, this guard needed to know that someone understood he was a real person with real feelings. Maybe a simple gesture of recognition would mean as much to him as it would mean to Tommy. The idea felt right in Tommy's heart, the way all his best decisions usually did. It wasn't about breaking rules or causing a scene. It was about one human being reaching out to another with pure, innocent intention. Tommy's mother was looking around the courtyard, reading an information plaque about the castle's history. Other tourists wandered past, most of them focused on taking photos or moving on to the next site. No one was paying particular attention to one small boy at the rope barrier. Tommy took a deep breath, the way he always did before making an important decision. His heart was beating fast, but not with fear, with anticipation. He had learned to trust his instincts about people, and every instinct he had was telling him that this was the right thing to do. Slowly, carefully, Tommy lifted his small right hand from the rope barrier. For a moment he hesitated, his hands suspended in the space between himself and the guard. This was his last chance to change his mind, to play it safe, to follow all the expected rules. But something deeper than rules was guiding Tommy now. Something that spoke to the purest part of his 8-year-old heart. The part that believed in the fundamental goodness of people and the power of simple human kindness. With a trust that only a child could possess, Tommy reached his hand forward into the unknown, not sure exactly where it would land, but absolutely certain that it was reaching toward someone who would understand. Guard David Chen had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours, and his training had taught him to maintain perfect composure, regardless of circumstances. In his 4 years serving with the Queen's Guard, he had experienced every possible distraction. Tourists trying to make him laugh, children mimicking his stance, cameras flashing constantly in his face, and even the occasional bee that seemed determined to land on his nose. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what was about to happen. David had noticed the small boy earlier during the ceremony. It was hard not to notice him, actually. While other children were jumping up and down, pointing excitedly or asking endless questions, this boy stood perfectly still, his head tilted in concentration as if he were listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. From his peripheral vision, David could see that the boy was blind. The white cane, the way he oriented himself through sound, the gentle guidance of his mother. It all painted a picture that tugged at David's heart in a way that surprised him. David had always been good with children. Back home in Wales, he was the favorite uncle to his sister's 3 kids, always ready with a story or a game. Before joining the military, he had even considered becoming a teacher. There was something about the pure curiosity and joy of children that made him feel more connected to the best parts of himself. Standing guard duty was an honor, but it could also be isolating. Hours of maintaining perfect stillness while life moved around you, unable to interact with the world in any meaningful way. David had learned to find peace in the meditation-like state that guard duty required, but there were moments when the human part of him longed for connection. Today was one of those days. David had received a letter from home that morning. His nephew had been in the hospital with pneumonia, and while the boy was recovering well, the worry had stayed with David throughout his shift. Standing here in his formal role, he found himself thinking about how precious and fragile life could be, especially for children. When the ceremony ended and most tourists moved on, David noticed that the blind boy remained at the barrier. There was something about the child's stillness that reminded David of his own meditation during guard duty, a quality of deep attention and presence that was rare even among adults. David began to feel a strange sort of kinship with this small boy. Both of them were experiencing this moment in their own unique way. Both were paying attention to details that others might miss, and both were, in their own ways, separated from the normal flow of interaction around them. As the minutes passed, David became increasingly aware of the boy's presence. It wasn't just that he could see him in his peripheral vision. It was something deeper than that. The child seemed to be directing some kind of focused attention toward him, and David found himself oddly comforted by it. In his years of guard duty, David had become accustomed to being looked at constantly. Tourists took thousands of photos, children stared in wonder, and adults examined every detail of his uniform and bearing. But this felt different. This boy wasn't looking at him as a curiosity or a photo opportunity. Somehow, David sensed that the child was seeing him as a person. The thought almost made David want to smile, which would have been a serious breach of protocol. But there was something deeply touching about the idea that this boy, who couldn't see him with his eyes, might somehow be seeing him more clearly than anyone else had all day. David's training had taught him to be aware of everything in his environment while maintaining perfect stillness. He knew exactly how many people were in the courtyard, where they were positioned, and what they were doing. He could sense the boy's mother reading an information sign nearby, hear the conversations of other tourists, and feel the gentle breeze that was making the castle flags flutter overhead. But gradually, his awareness began to focus more and more on the small boy at the barrier. There was something about the child's energy that felt familiar and comforting. Maybe it reminded David of his nephew, or maybe there was just something universally touching about a child's pure attention and curiosity. David had heard stories from other guards about unexpected moments during duty, times when maintaining protocol became less important than responding to basic human need. There was the story of a guard who had quietly directed a lost elderly tourist toward the exit, or another who had nodded almost imperceptibly to acknowledge a veteran who was saluting him with tears in his eyes. These stories were never officially discussed, but they were part of the unofficial wisdom passed down among the guards. Sometimes the guards understood their highest duty wasn't to the rules themselves, but to the human values that the rules were meant to protect and serve. David was thinking about this when he became aware of movement at the barrier. The boy had lifted his hand from the rope and was reaching forward, his small arm extending through the space between them. For a split second, David's mind raced through his training. Guards were not supposed to interact with tourists. They were meant to remain as still as statues, maintaining the dignity and mystique of their role. Breaking protocol could result in serious consequences. But as David watched the boy's small hand reaching trustingly into empty space, all thoughts of rules and regulations seemed suddenly less important than the simple human moment unfolding before him. The child wasn't trying to cause trouble or break rules. David could sense the pure intention behind the gesture. It was simply a child reaching out to make a connection, to acknowledge the person he somehow sensed beneath the formal uniform. David's heart swelled with an emotion he hadn't expected. This little boy who couldn't see the ceremonial grandeur around him, who couldn't take photos or collect souvenirs, was offering the most precious gift he had, his trust and recognition. When the boy's small, warm hand finally made contact with David's gloved fingers, David felt something shift inside him. In that moment, he wasn't just a guard performing his duty. He was a human being touched by another human being's innocent faith and goodness. The boy's hand was so small, so trusting, so completely without fear or hesitation. David could feel the warmth of it even through his ceremonial gloves, and he could sense the boy's gentle joy at having found the connection he was seeking. For David, this moment crystallized everything he loved about serving his country and protecting the values that the monarchy represented. It wasn't about the pageantry or the tradition, important as those were. It was about protecting a world where children could reach out trustingly to strangers and find kindness waiting for them. David looked straight ahead, maintaining his formal posture and expression, but every fiber of his being was focused on the small hand that had found its way to his. This little boy had given him a gift more precious than any ceremony or honor. He had reminded David why service to others was the highest calling a person could have. In that moment, standing in the ancient courtyard of Windsor Castle, Guard David Chen made a decision that would change both their lives forever. David's mind raced through 4 years of rigorous training in the span of a heartbeat. The Queen's Guard regulations were crystal clear. Maintain perfect stillness, do not interact with tourists, preserve the dignity of the position at all costs. These weren't just suggestions. They were sacred duties that connected him to centuries of proud tradition. But as Tommy's small, trusting hand rested against his gloved fingers, David felt something deeper than duty calling to him. This wasn't a tourist trying to get a reaction for social media or a child testing boundaries for attention. This was pure human connection offered without expectation, given freely by someone who simply wanted to acknowledge the person beneath the uniform. David had always believed that the true purpose of the Queen's Guard went beyond the ceremonial aspects. Yes, they protected tradition and maintained the pageantry that millions of people came to see, but underneath all of that, they were guardians of something more important, the values that made their society worth protecting. Kindness, compassion, the belief that people could trust in the goodness of others. Looking at this situation, David realized that turning away from this child's innocent gesture would violate the very principles he had sworn to protect. Sometimes he understood with sudden clarity, serving the highest good meant making decisions that went beyond the letter of the law to honor its spirit. The boy's hand was so small against his own, David could feel the child's pulse through his thin skin, could sense the complete trust and hope in that gentle touch. Tommy wasn't asking for anything complicated or inappropriate. He was simply saying, in the only way he knew how, "I see you as a real person, and I hope you can see me too." David had grown up in a family that valued kindness above almost everything else. His grandmother, who had raised him after his parents divorced, always said that the measure of a person wasn't in following rules blindly, but in knowing when compassion should guide your choices. Rules are important, David, she would tell him, but they should serve love, not replace it. Standing there with Tommy's hand touching his, David heard his grandmother's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. This moment was about more than military protocol. This was about the kind of person David wanted to be, the kind of world he wanted to help create, very slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might draw attention from other tourists or his superior officers. David began to curl his fingers around Tommy's small hand. The movement was so subtle that anyone watching from a distance would barely notice it. But for Tommy, it was everything. The moment Tommy felt the guard's fingers gently close around his hand, his face transformed with pure joy. It was like watching the sun come up, a gradual brightening that started in his eyes and spread across his entire expression. David had never seen happiness so complete and unguarded. Tommy had hoped for acknowledgement, but he hadn't dared to dream of this kind of response. The guard's fingers were strong and warm, even through the formal gloves. More than that, they conveyed a message that went straight to Tommy's heart. I see you too. You matter. This moment matters. For several precious seconds, they stayed connected like that, the 8-year-old boy and the Royal Guard, separated by a rope barrier and centuries of protocol, but united by something much more powerful than any rule or regulation. David maintained his formal posture and expression, looking straight ahead as his training demanded. To casual observers, he appeared to be the perfect example of royal discipline, but his hand told a different story, offering the gentlest of connections to a child who had reached out in faith. Tommy felt like his heart might burst with happiness. This wasn't just about touching the guard's hand, it was about being seen and acknowledged for who he was. So often in his life, adults either ignored him because of his blindness or treated him like he was fragile and different. But this guard was treating him like a real person whose friendship was worth accepting. David found himself thinking about his nephew again, the one who had been sick. He imagined how he would want someone to treat that little boy if he were ever in a foreign place, reaching out for connection and comfort. The thought strengthened his resolve that he was doing the right thing. Around them, the normal flow of castle life continued. Other tourists walked by, taking photos and reading guidebooks. A group of school children passed with their teacher, chattering excitedly about everything they were seeing. Security guards made their rounds and other royal guards maintained their posts throughout the courtyard. But for David and Tommy, the rest of the world had faded into background. They were sharing something that transcended their circumstances. A moment of pure human recognition that reminded both of them why kindness mattered more than anything else. Tommy's mother, Lisa, had finished reading the information plaque and turned back to check on her son. When she saw what was happening, her first instinct was to worry that Tommy was bothering the guard. She started to move forward to gently pull her son away, but something in the scene stopped her. The guard's posture remained perfectly professional, and there was something about the whole interaction that felt sacred rather than inappropriate. Lisa had watched her son navigate the world for 8 years, and she had learned to trust his instincts about people. If Tommy felt safe with this person, there was probably a good reason for it. Instead of interrupting, Lisa found herself reaching for her phone. This was a moment she wanted to remember forever. Her brave, loving son reaching out to the world and finding kindness waiting for him. David was acutely aware that they couldn't maintain this connection indefinitely. His training told him that even this brief interaction was pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable. But he also knew that sometimes the most important moments in life were the ones that couldn't last forever. He gave Tommy's hand one final, gentle squeeze, a message of farewell and gratitude wrapped in the simplest of gestures. Then, slowly and carefully, he relaxed his fingers, allowing Tommy's hand to slip away while maintaining the dignity of his position. Tommy understood immediately. The guard had given him what he could, when he could, in the way that he could. It was more than enough. It was perfect. As Tommy's hand returned to the rope barrier, both he and David carried with them the memory of a moment when two people had seen past all the barriers between them, to find the simple truth that connected all human beings. The need to be acknowledged, accepted, and treated with kindness. Neither of them knew it yet, but that moment of connection was about to touch the lives of millions of people around the world. Sometimes the smallest acts of love create the biggest waves of change. The gentle squeeze of David's hand had lasted only a few seconds, but for Tommy, Those seconds contained a lifetime of meaning. As his small hand returned to grip the rope barrier, he felt like he was glowing from the inside out. The guard had not only acknowledged him but had responded with such kindness that Tommy's faith in the goodness of people felt completely renewed. Tommy stayed exactly where he was, not wanting to break the invisible connection that still seemed to link him to the guard. Even though they were no longer touching, something had been established between them that went deeper than physical contact. It was like they were having a conversation without words, sharing thoughts and feelings through the simple act of being present with each other. David, still maintaining his perfectly professional posture, found himself more aware of the boy's presence than he had ever been of any tourist during his years of service. The child's joy was so pure and evident that David could feel it radiating across the space between them. It reminded him of why he had wanted to serve in the first place, to be part of something that protected and celebrated the best aspects of human nature. Around them, other visitors were beginning to notice that something special was happening. Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher from Scotland who was visiting the castle with her book club, had witnessed the entire interaction. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking slightly with emotion. "Girls," she whispered to her companions, "you need to see this." That little boy just reached out to the guard, and the guard actually responded. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Her friend Margaret looked over and immediately understood what had made Mrs. Patterson so emotional. The scene before them was like a living illustration of everything that was good about humanity. Innocence meeting compassion, trust being rewarded with kindness, barriers being dissolved by simple human connection. Tommy's mother, Lisa, had managed to capture a few photos of the interaction, but she found herself lowering her phone to simply watch. This wasn't a moment that needed to be documented as much as it needed to be experienced. Her heart was full of pride for her brave son and gratitude for the guard who had seen Tommy's gesture, for what it was, an offer of friendship from a child who believed in the goodness of people. A family from Japan had also noticed the interaction. The father, who spoke limited English, tried to explain to his wife and children what they had just witnessed. Even across language barriers, the beauty of the moment was unmistakable. Their teenage daughter, who had been somewhat bored by the castle tour until now, found herself completely captivated by the silent communication between the boy and the guard. "Dad," she said quietly in Japanese, "I want to remember this forever." Her father nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They had come to Windsor expecting to see historical buildings and ceremonial pageantry. Instead, they were witnessing something much more precious, a moment of pure human connection that transcended all cultural and social boundaries. Tommy remained at the barrier, his head tilted in that characteristic way that meant he was processing something important. He could sense the change in the atmosphere around him. More people seemed to be paying attention. Voices were softer and more reverent, and there was a quality in the air that felt almost sacred. "Mom," Tommy whispered, "people are watching us, aren't they?" Lisa looked around at the small crowd that had begun to gather. "Yes, sweetheart. I think people saw what happened between you and the guard, and they're touched by it." Tommy considered this for a moment. Are they happy watching, or are they upset that I broke the rules? Lisa looked at the faces around them, expressions of wonder, tears in several people's eyes, smiles of pure joy. "They're very happy, Tommy. What you did was beautiful, and everyone can see that." David could hear snippets of conversation from the growing crowd, and what he heard filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. People were talking about kindness, about the power of simple gestures, about how this moment had reminded them of what really mattered in life. An elderly gentleman standing nearby turned to his wife and said, "In 40 years of marriage, I've never seen anything that moved me quite like this. That boy's courage and that guard's compassion, it's restored my faith in people." A young mother holding her toddler explained quietly to her child, "Do you see how the little boy was brave enough to say hello and how the nice guard said hello back? That's what it means to be kind to each other." Even the other royal guards positioned around the courtyard had become aware that something significant was happening. While they maintained their posts and professional demeanor, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that spoke to the power of what David and Tommy had shared. Tommy could feel all of this attention, but instead of making him nervous, it filled him with a sense of purpose. Maybe his reach toward the guard hadn't just been about his own curiosity and desire for connection. Maybe it had been about showing everyone around them that kindness was possible, even in the most formal and rule-bound situations. "The guard is still there, isn't he, Mom?" Tommy asked softly. "Yes, he's still at his post, still standing perfectly straight and looking ahead just like he's supposed to." Tommy nodded with satisfaction. "But he knows I'm here too." "I think he does, sweetheart," and Tommy was right. David was intensely aware of the boy's continued presence, and he found himself hoping that Tommy would stay a little longer. There was something comforting about sharing this quiet space with someone who had seen past all the ceremony and tradition to recognize the person underneath. More tourists were stopping now, drawn by the unusual stillness and attention of the crowd. Many of them didn't understand what had happened, but they could sense that they had walked into the aftermath of something special. The atmosphere in this part of the courtyard felt different from the usual bustling energy of tourist activity. Mrs. Patterson found herself wiping away tears as she continued to watch the boy and the guard. "In all my years of teaching," she said to her friends, "I've tried to show children that the world is full of good people. This little one just proved it to everyone here." The Japanese teenager had taken out her journal and was trying to write down her feelings about what she had witnessed. She wanted to remember not just what had happened, but how it had made her feel, how it had changed her understanding of what was possible when people chose kindness over fear. Tommy's extraordinary hearing was picking up fragments of all these conversations, and each one made him feel more confident that he had done the right thing. He had reached out in hope, and that hope had been rewarded not just by the guard's response, but by the way it had touched everyone who witnessed it. As the minutes passed, Tommy began to understand that this moment had become about more than just him and the guard. It had become a gift to everyone present, a reminder that underneath all the differences that seemed to separate people, there was a fundamental human desire to connect with each other with kindness and respect. The silent conversation between Tommy and David continued, carried by their shared awareness of each other's presence and the knowledge that they had created something beautiful together. Neither words nor further touch were necessary. They had said everything that needed to be said in that one perfect moment of connection. Mrs. Patterson had never considered herself particularly good with technology, but as she watched Tommy and the guard continue their silent connection, she felt compelled to share what she had witnessed. With slightly trembling fingers, she posted the photo she had taken to her Facebook account, along with a caption that came straight from her heart. "Today I witnessed the most beautiful moment at Windsor Castle. A blind little boy reached out to one of the Queen's guards, and this wonderful man responded with such gentle kindness. In a world that often feels divided, this reminded me that compassion is universal. Some moments restore your faith in humanity." What Mrs. Patterson didn't expect was how quickly that post would begin to spread. Within an hour, her daughter in Edinburgh had shared it. Then her daughter's friends began sharing it. By evening, it had been shared hundreds of times across the United Kingdom, each person adding their own words about why the image had touched them so deeply. Meanwhile, the Japanese teenager, whose name was Yuki, had posted her own photos and description on Instagram. Writing in both Japanese and English, she shared her feelings about witnessing a moment when barriers disappeared and hearts connected. Her post began gaining traction among her international school friends, who shared it with their own networks across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Tommy's mother, Lisa, had also shared her photos, but on a smaller scale, just with family and close friends. However, one of those friends was a journalist who immediately recognized the power of the story. After getting Lisa's permission, she wrote a brief article for her local newspaper about the touching encounter, focusing on how the guard's small act of kindness had created such a profound moment of connection. But the moment that really made the story explode, globally, came when Ben Morrison, a travel blogger from Australia who had been at Windsor that day, posted his video footage on TikTok. He had captured the entire interaction from beginning to end, including the crowd's reaction and the obvious emotion of everyone who witnessed it. Ben's video was accompanied by a simple caption, "Sometimes the most powerful moments happen in silence. This blind boy's courage and this guard's compassion just restored my faith in humanity. Share this if it touched your heart too." The video began its journey around the world at the speed of the internet. Within 12 hours, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Within 24 hours, that number had grown to 10 million. Comments poured in from every continent in dozens of languages, all expressing similar themes of hope, kindness, and renewed faith in human goodness. "I'm crying happy tears watching this," wrote someone from Brazil. "This is what the world needs more of," commented a viewer from India. "My son has autism, and this gives me hope that people will see his heart, not just his differences," shared a mother from Canada. News outlets began picking up the story. The BBC ran a segment on their morning show about the touching moment that's captured hearts worldwide. CNN International featured it in their Good News segment. Even international newspapers that rarely covered such human interest stories found themselves unable to resist the universal appeal of Tommy and David's connection. The palace took notice as well. Social media managers for the royal family's official accounts had been monitoring the spread of the story, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of positive representation of royal traditions and values that resonated with people around the world. After careful consideration and proper protocols, the royal family's official Twitter account shared Ben's video with their own comment: "The values of compassion and service that our guards represent every day. A beautiful reminder that kindness knows no boundaries." That royal endorsement sent the story into the stratosphere. Major news networks around the world began running features about the encounter. Talk show hosts discussed it as an example of humanity at its best. The video was translated into dozens of languages and shared on platforms that Tommy and his mother had never even heard of. But perhaps the most meaningful responses came from other families with disabled children. Parents began sharing their own stories of times when strangers had shown unexpected kindness to their children. Support groups for families with visually impaired children used the video as an example of how their children could confidently engage with the world around them. Dr. Williams, a child psychologist who specialized in working with blind and visually impaired children, was interviewed on several news programs about the significance of Tommy's action. "What this young boy demonstrated," she explained, "is the natural human capacity for connection that exists beyond our physical limitations. His courage to reach out and the guard's beautiful response shows us that meaningful communication happens on many levels." Schools around the world began using the story in their lessons about kindness, diversity, and courage. Teachers found that students who might not normally engage with discussions about empathy were captivated by the simple power of Tommy's gesture and David's response. The story even reached places where English wasn't the primary language. A children's program in Japan featured an animated recreation of the encounter, using it to teach young viewers about the importance of reaching out to others with kindness. A school in Kenya incorporated the story into their English lessons, with students writing their own essays about times when small gestures had made big differences in their lives. Back at home, Tommy had no idea that his simple moment of reaching out had touched millions of lives around the world. His mother had shown him some of the initial responses, reading him comments from people who had been moved by what they witnessed. But the full scope of the story's impact was beyond anything either of them had imagined. Tommy was most excited about the responses from other children. Lisa read him dozens of messages from kids around the world who said that watching his courage had inspired them to be braver in their own lives. Some were from children with disabilities who felt encouraged to engage more confidently with the world around them. Others were from children who had never thought much about what it might be like to navigate the world without sight, and who had been inspired by Tommy's fearless approach to making connections. "Mom," Tommy said after listening to several of these messages, "I just wanted to say hello to the nice guard. I didn't know it would make so many people happy." "Sometimes the most important things we do are the ones that feel completely natural to us," Lisa replied, hugging her son close. "You followed your heart, and that reminded millions of people to follow theirs too." The ripple effects continued to spread in ways both large and small. Random acts of kindness increased noticeably in the days following the story's viral spread, as people found themselves inspired to reach out to others in their own communities. Customer service representatives reported more patience and kindness from customers. Teachers noticed students being more inclusive with classmates who seemed different or isolated. Even David, still maintaining his professional duties as a royal guard, had become aware that something extraordinary had grown from their brief moment of connection. While he couldn't access social media during his service, his family and friends had kept him informed about how the story was spreading and the positive impact it was having on people around the world. The simple gesture of holding a child's hand for a few seconds had somehow managed to remind millions of people that Kindness was still possible, that connection was still worthwhile, and that sometimes the most powerful statements were made in silence. Neither Tommy nor David had set out to change the world that day. They had simply chosen to see each other as human beings worthy of kindness and respect. But in a time when the world often felt divided and disconnected, that choice had become exactly the reminder that people everywhere needed to see. 3 months after that magical moment at Windsor Castle, Tommy was sitting at the kitchen table with his mother when the phone rang. Lisa answered, expecting it to be one of her regular calls from work or family. Instead, she found herself speaking with someone from the royal household staff. "Mrs. Wilson, this is calling regarding your son Tommy and his encounter with one of our guards at Windsor Castle several months ago. We have a rather special invitation we'd like to extend to you both." Lisa's hand flew to her mouth in surprise. While she knew that the video of Tommy and the guard had spread around the world, she never imagined it would lead to direct contact from the royal family themselves. The voice on the phone continued warmly. "Guard David Chen has requested permission to invite Tommy back to the castle for a private tour. Given the positive impact of their encounter, and the beautiful example it set for people around the world, we would be honored to make this happen." When Lisa hung up the phone, she could barely contain her excitement. Tommy was in the living room, practicing his Braille reading, completely unaware that his life was about to become even more extraordinary. "Tommy," Lisa called, her voice shaking with joy, "I have some incredible news for you." Tommy looked up from his book, his face immediately bright with curiosity. "What is it, Mom? You sound really happy." "We just received an invitation to go back to Windsor Castle. The guard you met, his name is David. He wants to give you a special private tour." Tommy's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and then pure joy. "The same guard? The one who held my hand? The very same one. He specifically asked for permission to invite you back." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this incredible news. Then he asked the question that had been in his heart since that day at the castle. "Does this mean he wanted to be my friend too?" "I think it means exactly that, sweetheart." 2 weeks later, Tommy and Lisa found themselves once again approaching the gates of Windsor Castle. But this time, instead of joining a crowd of tourists, they were met by a member of the castle staff who escorted them through a private entrance. Tommy's excitement was palpable. He held tightly to his mother's hand as they walked through corridors that most visitors never saw, listening to the echo of their footsteps on ancient stone floors and breathing in the history that surrounded them. "Tommy," a familiar voice called out, and Tommy's head turned immediately toward the sound. "David," Tommy exclaimed, recognizing something in the guard's voice that matched the energy he had sensed that day at the barrier. David approached in his civilian clothes, jeans, and a casual shirt that made him look much younger than he had in his formal red uniform. "I'm so glad you came back. I've been thinking about you since that day we met." Tommy beamed. "I've been thinking about you too. I told everyone at school about my friend who's a royal guard. Well, today I get to be just David, and I'm going to show you parts of the castle that most people never get to see. Would you like that?" "Yes, please." For the next 3 hours, David gave Tommy the most comprehensive tour the castle had ever provided to an 8-year-old. But this wasn't a typical tour focused on what visitors could see. Instead, David had carefully planned an experience based on everything Tommy could touch, hear, and feel. They began in the Round Tower, where David let Tommy feel the massive stones that had been placed there nearly 1,000 years ago. "These stones have been here since before your great-great-great-grandfather's great-great-great-grandfather was born," David explained, watching Tommy's face light up with wonder as his hands explored the ancient walls. In the state apartments, David had received special permission to let Tommy carefully touch some of the historical artifacts. Tommy's fingers traced the intricate carvings on a chair that had been used by King George III, and he marveled at the smooth coolness of marble sculptures that were hundreds of years old. "Each of these things tells a story," David explained as Tommy explored, "and now you're part of the castle's story too. People will remember the day a brave boy reached out to make a friend, and how that friendship reminded everyone that kindness matters more than any rule." But the most special moment came when David took Tommy to the very spot where they had first met. Standing at the same barrier where Tommy had reached out 3 months earlier, David knelt down to Tommy's level. "Tommy, I want you to know something important. That day when you reached out to me, you gave me one of the greatest gifts I've ever received. You reminded me why I chose to serve, not just to follow rules, but to protect a world where people like you can trust in the goodness of others. Tommy listened carefully, then reached out again, not tentatively this time, but with the confidence of someone greeting a dear friend. David took his hand immediately. No protocol or ceremony between them now, just two friends sharing a moment. You know what the best part is? Tommy said. Everyone around the world saw that being kind is always the right choice. Mom showed me all the messages from kids who said our friendship helped them be braver. David nodded even though Tommy couldn't see the gesture. I've heard about that too. Letters have been coming to the castle from all over the world. Children, parents, teachers, all saying that our moment together inspired them to reach out to others with kindness. As their visit continued, David and Tommy discovered they had more in common than either had expected. Both loved history and stories about adventure. Both had always felt a special connection to helping others. And both believed that the most important thing in life was treating everyone with respect and kindness. Before they left that day, David had one more surprise. He presented Tommy with a special gift, a small piece of stone from the castle's original construction, mounted on a wooden base with a Braille inscription that read, "For Tommy, whose courage reminds us that friendship knows no barriers. From your friend, David." Tommy held the stone carefully, his fingers tracing its rough surface. "This is the most special thing anyone has ever given me," he said softly. "And your friendship is the most special thing anyone has ever given me," David replied. As Tommy and Lisa prepared to leave, David made a promise that would shape both their futures. "This isn't goodbye, Tommy. You're my friend now, and friends stay in touch. I want to hear about school and your adventures, and all the new friends I know you're going to make." Over the following months, David and Tommy maintained their friendship through letters, phone calls, and occasional visits. David would send Tommy postcards from places he traveled with the guard unit, describing everything he saw in vivid detail so Tommy could experience it through his words. Tommy, meanwhile, continued to inspire everyone around him with his fearless approach to making connections. Emboldened by his experience with David, he reached out to classmates, neighbors, and strangers with the same open heart that had started their friendship. Each new connection reminded him of the lesson he had learned at Windsor Castle, that kindness was always possible, and that reaching out in friendship was never a mistake. Their story continued to spread and inspire people long after the initial viral moment had passed. Schools around the world still use their encounter as an example of courage and kindness. Parents told their children about the blind boy and the guard who chose compassion over protocol. But for Tommy and David, the most important part of their story wasn't the fame or the inspiration they had provided to others. It was the simple truth that they had found in each other exactly what everyone hopes to find when they reach out to the world: a friend who sees their heart and chooses to respond with love. Years later, when Tommy was older and able to understand the full impact of that moment at Windsor Castle, he would often think about how one small gesture of faith had created ripples of kindness that spread around the entire world. But he would always remember that the most precious outcome wasn't the global impact. It was the friendship that began when two people chose to see, past all the barriers between them, to the fundamental goodness that connects all human beings. And David, whenever he stood guard duty at the castle, would remember the day a small boy taught him that sometimes the most important service you can provide is simply being human enough to hold someone's hand when they reach out in hope.